Hey, it's Sam Hill, and today I'm going to be bringing to you event listeners with GraphQL and React hooks. So what do I mean when I say logging event listeners with GraphQL and React hooks? Well, what that entirely means is that we're going to be able to be using React hooks and building out a foundation of being able to manipulate the DOM and the potentials that the DOM has for us to be able to track, specifically in this case, click events that will allow us to understand the users that like to interact with our applications and understanding their wants and desires. And I kicked this off by writing a blog initially, and I'll be following along with my blog today of saying hard building an app that fits a user's wants and desires, right? We're all looking to be able to do that and be able to understand a user and what they are hoping to achieve by using our application. Harder, building an app and logging the activity to understand all the wants and desires of a user, right? So the only way we can really discover that is by being able to understand the user and how they want to be able to use our application. And how do we do that? Well, I'm going to show you a little bit of today of how we can use certain APIs. And specifically, we're going to be going through, obviously, a really popular one that everyone uses called Google Analytics. That's a very standard one that a lot of people want to just throw on their applications or their websites and be able to understand page paths and kind of how people work through and have flows of their application as they continue to interact with your app. And then we will be kind of showing that on a React application today. And as you can see, this is kind of the end goal of what we're going to be able to do. And we're going to be writing a mutation. And as you can see, I have a little Easter egg there of amplitude. And if you read through the blog, it'll say a lot about amplitude. And I'll be showing that as well today. We're going to be writing events to amplitude, which is a really awesome source for being able to track activities. And we are going to be writing GraphQL mutations to Amplitude's analytics site to be able to see that. And we're going to be writing it with the user ID that is coming from the client ID of Google Analytics. And why is that important? Because it'll allow us to tie Google Analytics and Amplitude together so that we'll all have one synonymous client ID associated with each individual user that interacts with the site. It's completely anonymous, but it allows us to understand pathways and a user's clicks along with the page paths that they're interacting with when they come to your site for an individual session. And as you can see, as we go down, we're going to then get responses and ensure that we are actually tracking the correct path and that we got a 200 back, code 200. And we're seeing what we want to see and that the events are tracking. So if anyone has any questions and if anyone's on, feel free to throw it at me right now. But if not, we're going to dive right in and be able to show how we can track these things up. And you can always just follow along the blog initially. We also have a sample repo out there, steps and samples. And I'll show that for you. Pop it on down. I think I have steps and samples, GitHub repo. If you want to just be able to pull this down, you can do that right here as well. It's in the blog, and you should have no problem being able to get this up and running. And you just have to include your config.yaml with your StepSend API, and you have to sign up for StepSend to be able to track off your StepSend endpoint that you'll be adding into your environment variables. So, but I'm going to kind of walk through this, and we're going to kick it off. So first thing we want to do is create our React app, right? React makes that super easy. So I'll clear that. Way too many screenshots. And that'll take some time. So I'm going to walk through the other things. But what it should do is immediately run up our application and spin it up at localhost 3000. And setting up Google Analytics, you want to create a universal analytics property. The reason that is because React GA, that's just the current dependency that they have and what they support is universal analytics property. So it's going to have that UA, bunch of random numbers, and then the properties to follow. You have npm install React GA. We'll be doing that right after we have it installed locally. And I think React by default installs a yarn package, but when we run npm install here, you can also do a yarn add, and that'll just keep a yarn file. But when we do npm install, it'll add a package lock.json. I chose not to go with Google Analytics event tracking. And the reason that is because creating Google Analytics custom events, I consider it complex. It's not too easy. And the reason is because it's pretty limited on the labels that you want to be able to provide. You don't really know what you should label it, and you're limited to those three. And you find out that it's a lot of name game and what you should be naming each individual one. What I like about Amplitude is it's entirely customizable. And it's super easy to throw it at the API. To be able to do that with Google Analytics, we would be doing it all on the front end, but I wanted to be able to use GraphQL and just write it all on server side and be able to send the data through there. And we'll be capturing client side and being able to send it to our backend StepSend API and being able to log all this data, and then we aren't entirely dependent on one single core platform, Google Analytics, and we can all tie it together, like I said, with that user ID that we'll be creating. So it might be created by now, probably spun up in some other browser I have, but if we take a peek, localhost, oh, sorry, I have another one up, and the app running. Let me see. There we go. Let's try it again. Probably why we got a little error there. Yep. Okay, yeah, no problem. So we'll just spin that up, and I'll open it up anyway, because it did get it on my desktop. So if we take a peek in here, demo event tracking should be tracking. I think I did that in my desktop. Yep, and it should be empty. Take a quick peek. And one thing I know that we won't have in here is a context file, because we'll be writing it. And as you can see, yep, we should just have it yarn locked. So I think that's the only thing I didn't have was it didn't spin up locally, but that's very easy to do, right? npm run start. And this is, anyone can do this right away. It'll kick off. And let me make sure I have it pulling up on the right. I always have too many browsers open at a time. I'm sure a lot of people can agree with that lifestyle. Here we are. Nothing counts the logging in here yet, right? We just have a simple app, nothing going on. Just clicking around. We'll eventually start seeing things tracking. So now that we're here, next thing I said we needed to do, I'll do yarn add. Just keep yarn, but you can do npm install too. It'll work just as well. And what we're doing is we're installing Graphql, which is an npm package that will just allow us to be able to have pretty easy tracking and be able to use React with our, as they show here, universal property code. And very easy to be able to track page views and things like that. It works very similar to just GA dot when you want to actually just do it in your actual header files. Very similar to how people would do it in, say, a WordPress environment or PHP or just raw HTML. Instead of outside of a React application, you would just use a standard GA dot, and it works very similar to that API dependency. So we should have it installed now. Awesome. Still just have the yarn lock, but we can see that those two are manipulated. So we pop into here, and let's see what we have to do next, right? So the next step we're thinking is after we get everything rocking, we want to be able to then create our steps and endpoint. And this is something where you guys can kind of just copy it down, make it super easy to be able to just immediately copy all this stuff. But I can just do it here. So what we're going to be doing is calling steps in, right? And creating, well, not calling it, we're just creating a folder called steps in. Digging in steps in, awesome. And then we'll touch, and then we'll call it amplitude. Well, this open, and we can see we have that. And amplitude is where we're going to be actually creating our schema for our amplitude API that we'll be sourcing. And then we want to touch config.yaml, index.graphql. Config.yaml is going to have our actual keys that we're going to generate. And the index.graphql is what steps in is going to source from and what we're going to be calling our amplitude schema into. We'll have that. And so now we have those running. And I have this here where we have the schema, right? So index.graphql is just going to be calling our amplitude.graphql file. Nothing special there other than the fact that it's going to be understanding which queries are going to be able to come in. So if we want to be able to add more schemas and separate our schema files so that we have a little more organization in here, and we want to bring in other third-party APIs that we want to eventually start tracking, or any other softwares that you want to log data to, you can just put that right alongside here in your index.graphql and create another schema in here like I did with my amplitude.graphql. And then I'll kind of go through here. This query we won't be using today, but that's kind of if you just want to be able to see users. There's usually a way of being able to use UTM parameters on this as well to be able to see that. But really, we wanted to just have a query in here in case if anyone wanted to kick one off. But mostly the mutation is where we're going to be focusing on, being able to write a post of an amplitude event. That's what we're going to be doing. And we have a post body in there, and it's going to be an application JSON. And it's going to be to our batch API so that we can upload it to event track. And I don't think it's real time the way it does it here with this API, but it will still enable us to be able to see it relatively quick so that I think I can show it in the demo. So pop over here, amplitude.graphql, right? So I have a GraphQL dependency, which or an extension in VS Code that allows me to be able to see kind of the color scheme here. If it's your first time, I would highly recommend getting an extension instead of everything coming in as white when you have a GraphQL file. It organizes your thoughts a lot more and allows you to kind of see how the types are actually being created and your queries and mutations are actually going to be able to be written. So we have amplitude event, which is what we're going to be focusing on. That's going to just return a bunch of integers of saying, yes, you successfully had it. Here's the upload time that it took, how many events you actually sent over, and then the actual bytes of the size that you upload. So nothing that we want to actually provide the user. So we aren't going to have to focus on waiting for that response and providing it on the front end. We're going to be focusing mostly on just sending it out and actually sending the request and being able to use React hooks to enable us to do that really, really quickly and kind of what they term a side effect as the application continues to operate regularly. So we have that. And then the last thing we need is the config.yaml right here. And I'm going to hide my screen real quick because that's what you should do when you have those kind of things coming in, configurations. Let me just pull up my keys. And you could be provided those just in your settings of your Amplitude account. And I created a dummy Amplitude account that was very easy to set up for this. And let me see where I have it right here. Awesome. And while I'm at it, I'm going to add my environment as well. And then I'll just talk through that one at a later point. And the env file, if you're familiar with React applications, is going to be writing this directly in the root of your application. So it's going to be in the root alongside of like the yarn and the package.json and things like that we had in there. So I'll start sharing it again because we're back in business. Awesome. And so I just added it right here, config.yaml and the env file. And now you should be able to set those up and you'll be able to see that in the blog as well, the env file, and we'll get to that point eventually. But now looks like we kind of have everything ready to be able to actually spin this up. So let's see if we can get the steps and endpoint to run. And this is the first step of just making sure we can actually write an event. And this is how easy it is to do on steps end, right? Make sure you install the CLI so that you can easily run this. And if you successfully do it, it'll add a send config.json saying, okay, demo/events is the endpoint that you want to create. I declared that when I wanted to write it out. It actually generates an endpoint for me here. And now if I go to localhost 5000, hop over. You can see you have query user search. We're not going to be using that, right? We want to be writing a mutation. So I'm going to pop this open and you can see that you have all these required. You have the asterisk there saying required fields that must be provided in order for this to be a successful event that needs to be posted to the Amplitude batch API. That's going to be our REST endpoint. So I'm going to pop back over here and grab an example. And this is just an event type click, very simple. Path is app header, which I believe is something that React gives us as a default. So it'll look very similar. Event time, you have to do a timestamp of date time. And then user ID, I just have a dummy user ID that you could probably already see over there that I've tested with. So sorry for all the flipping. I'm going to head back up here. I don't see any questions yet, so I think we're good. Oh, copy the whole thing. Wrapping a mutation inside a mutation, that won't do the job. And awesome. Just like that, we got a response that we were looking for, meaning that we successfully wrote to the batch API. As easy as that with the steps end endpoint. And now we were successfully able to write a mutation. And now we just have to put it into our React app. So I think I'll wait a little bit to show it on the Amplitude side because it's not in real time, but it'll come there very soon. And we'll be able to see it tracking and it'll give us a notification when it's ready. Pop it on down. Yep, I added that. Awesome. And we can see that we just want to make a directory called source context, right? So in our source file, we want to be able to write that. And then we want to create an analytics.js. And what this is it's contents it's going to be context into our application that's going to allow us to, sorry, I'll put it right here. My thought was analytics.js. It's kind of, I want to state this correctly. It's going to be creating a context to where we are going to be wrapping our application And it's going to be everything that is happening on the actual interaction of the body you can think of in the actual DOM of the application. We are wrapping it with context. So no matter what page we go to, it's as if we are having a global context, and any individual page that you go to in a React application, you have different routes and things that you want to be able to have behaviors for users to be able to go through. When you create context, it creates almost like a global wrapper that allows you to have a state that you can pass down into each individual component and be able to modify and then change that global state. That makes it really easy for you to be able to have kind of a, what they would term like a Redis that has a state management system, but React allows us to kind of do that in our own application. So I will come into here and I will create that inside the source file, right? So you can just add it like this. Context. Analytics. Yes. And then we'll copy this right away and I'll talk about it. So what's kind of going on here is you can see we have the dependency that we installed, and we have 3 hooks that we're going to be using inside of this application. And the first thing we're going to be doing is creating our context. And what will happen when we create our context is now when we actually want to be able to, down here, create a provider and wrap it, it'll understand, okay, this is context with a state value that is going to be globally represented throughout the routes in our application. In this case, we're not going to be creating our routes on this one, but if you wanted to go and then create routes, this would be a very easy way of being able to provide a global state and a state management all around your application without having to write a bunch of different state props in each component. And instead, you can just manipulate that from the global parameters of your context. And if you kind of come into here, you can see you have a process env, right? We're just going to have the GAID that we talked about earlier, and we're going to have our steps and endpoints that we're eventually going to be sending the mutation to that will write to our amplitude endpoint, right? Which if I were to pop back over here, we can now see that we had a new event pop in here, right? And I had that user ID come in. And what we'll be able to see is user ID represented with a click type and then a timestamp of when it occurred, which I believe is logged here, right? And then you pop in and you can see path is app header, which was just our test path that we wanted to be able to represent. So what happens after this is we want to be able to get the actual path that we're going to be logging right here and now for our Google Analytics side. And so in our analytics provider, which is just a function that passes in props, we're going to have a use effect, right? And so use effect is a side effect React hook that allows us to be able to, on the initialization of our application, run something on the side. And if you put kind of a empty bracket at the end, it allows it to just take in the props that you're giving it, which in this case is going to be, I believe the props that we're initiating here is nothing to this point that we're going to be passing in, but it'll allow us to be able to initialize our React application from our React ID and then be able to set our user ID to the client ID that is generated through our React Google Analytics. So that's really all that's happening is right when our application is loaded on each individual page, React GA will initialize. And you could probably write something to where it doesn't have to initialize on every single page, right? Because as a user has a session, you may not have to do that every single time. But for code cleanliness on this one and for a lack of confusion, it's being initialized on each page load. And then we have the tracker, right? Which is something that I wanted to be able to write here so that we could set our user ID and eventually be able to get that user ID from Google Analytics to pass into our amplitude event. But here we're just setting user ID to a client ID that's going to be associated, which is that anonymous ID that we're able to generate. And then I just have set user ID to that same client ID that's being generated. And that is in case if we ever want to be able to pass that user ID into any components that are children of this wrapper, right? And in this case, we aren't going to start doing anything in our lower components. We just want to be able to track events on any page that we're on, depending on the router. So in this case, we won't be actually doing the routing and passing the state down, but that's something that this will enable you to be able to do as you want to continue building out your application. So I think on this one, we are good to go on being able to demo Google Analytics firing. So I'll open up an integrated terminal right here. And we can actually turn this off because steps n will continue to support us at that endpoint, which I have in my env file. And so npm run start, spin that up, and we'll kind of check over here. Yep. Awesome. We have a tracking here, and let's see if Google Analytics is firing. And if we go over to real-time overview, let's check it out. Well, let's see if I'm at the right point, right? Make sure I'm at the right point. Yes, yes, yes. Ah, here we go. You know what I didn't do was I didn't wrap the DOM. So the DOM still needs us to be able to provide it in the index.js. I was just creating the analytics, but we haven't called the analytics to our actual application yet. So that's what we're missing. And we have to actually wrap and put our analytics provider in our core application root index.js file, which is in your source, come into index.js, right? And sometimes I like this, and sometimes it doesn't work for me. Come in amplitude, or it was analytics provider. There we go. Yep, it imported it for us there. And then we'll just finish that off. It should be wrapped very similarly to how we had it here, right? So all around our application. So now anywhere, if we were to want to add, React router into our index.js file and put that just underneath our analytics provider here, and say adding routes here, right? And install that dependency and be able to start using routes in our React app, you'll have that global context throughout your application. That's what the power of this provides. And now if we run it, is assigned, but its value is never used. So yep, that makes sense because we aren't running the event yet. So that's the errors we want to see because we aren't writing our mutation yet to be able to track click events. We're just actually initializing Google Analytics and being able to track the page views as individuals come into the app, right? Now we refresh, and you can also check the console to make sure it actually fires, right? So you can see I have debug on true. So I created a dummy demo Google Analytics account that shows that it's firing. Debug true, I highly recommend you use it in your development environments to make sure that it's actually firing correctly. It runs GA send page view for us. And then you have the page, which is just the backslash, right? The home page. So if we pop over now, there it is, it's tracking. So now that we wrapped our entire app with the global context of analytics provider, we have the state that can be passed down, right? So we essentially have that state right here, value state of the user ID. It has the ability to go anywhere throughout our application that we want and be able to call it into our app.js file. And we just have to use context. So there is a React hook also called use context. And then if you use the context of your analytics provider, you can get that state, manipulate it, and then you can dispatch it back up to your global state in our analytics.js context file. So you can take a peek there and see that it's running. So now we have an event firing with an associated user ID, right? So if we were to pop into here and see user explorer, we'd be able to see we have client IDs in here, and that's just a anonymous client ID that's being generated for this individual user. And I believe this is probably one that I tested a while back, and it might not be real time. Oh, no, there you go. I think that may be real time for today. Yep, today's the 12th. So we have firing here, and we have the client ID being associated. So if we were to then pop back over and send this mutation, we'll just grab this client ID here and be able to send it over to Amplitude. So we can always compare and contrast between the two third-party APIs. Third-party apps. One of them we're explicitly writing to the API. One we're using, an NPM package to be able to compare and contrast the user interactions as they go throughout our application. So let's continue on and write that GraphQL mutation out. See, it's tracking. Great. That's exactly what we wanted. Sam jumped to conclusions. So all is good. But now let's actually get that event listener, right? So from this point on, we have a use effect. And I'm going to go right back in here. I don't know why I closed it. We're going to write a second use effect. You can write multiple use effects in an app in a single core component. And even when you're creating context, it allows us to be able to write one use effect that will stop no matter how many times the application is initialized. And in this case, if the app is initialized at any point and there's ever a click event going on, we'll capture that, right? And we'll be able to then write it into our event handler here. That'll then track the closest HTML element, and we'll just console log that HTML element right here. So this is just pure DOM manipulation, right? You can look this up on, MDN Mozilla, and you can follow through of, tracking event listeners to the document body and being able to capture that event and pass it into a function that can do whatever it wants with those elements that were captured on a click event, right? Very standard core JavaScript functionality that allows us to be able to track these events. The key is adding GraphQL into this, which we'll be doing next. But let's see what happens when we pop up and click that, right? Just a fun little recap. And I'll actually remove debug true on this one so that we can stop seeing that being initialized. Right, so now we're just initializing it without the debug. So we have that firing, nothing to our point yet. Click it, and great, exactly what we expect. App header, and we capture that element right there. It's being captured on line 29. See what is being tracked in the closest capture. So awesome. We know that we're capturing the HTML element on click. And then the first thing we do is, we capture it, pass it into the handler. And then when everything's done executing, we return the removement of that click event to make sure that if there's a large succession of clicks, that there's no conflicts going on, and that one happens, one ends, one happens, one ends. And it can all happen in succession very quickly, and it knows when to stop. So now that we have that tracking, the next thing is to capture what we want from this HTML element and be able to log it over in our click events. So if you continue to go down, write a GraphQL mutation, right? So I added a lot of other stuff in here of just being able to capture variables that we're going to be passing in, but I'm going to grab this function, and it's just called the handler function, and it gets a lot bigger there as we can see, but I'll talk through it. So lines 26 through 30 are now going to become much larger. But what we're going to be able to do here is take an async event, and then we're going to capture now, which is just the date right now. It's a local string. So it's going to capture, I believe, the timestamp of the individual user that is actually coming on of that time, the time of event that occurred in that time zone. If you want to specify a time zone in here, you can do that as well. Just make sure it has good browser support to be able to do that, and do in this case, it would be like America, Chicago, or something like that. And you can look that up online and ensure that you do that. Just don't do, EST or Pacific Standard Time. That won't work with certain browsers like Firefox. And then what we want to do is the same kind of similar thing, right? We already had that. We get the closest element, and then we have an empty variable called path that we're eventually going to assign when we write out this do while loop. And what that is we're reassigning the element to the reference point that we're going to be having on the event click, and then do this loop while we have a parent node. So what does this mean? So when we have a tag and we're looking for the closest tag name, meaning, div, h1 tag, p tag, all the way up to our HTML tag is what we're going to be doing and working up parent nodes. And then we're going to look for an ID. And if there's a reference ID, get it. Otherwise, don't. And then if there's classes for each class, push it into a class one that we'll be able to log. And then the path, we're going to generate the tag with classes and then the ID. And we're going to add it to all the other paths that we've had before. And it'll create this one really, really long string for us to be able to, or one really, really long array that we'll be able to join when we get out of this while loop after we continue to work up the parent nodes and join them all together with a greater than sign showing that we're going from the smallest point of the HTML element all the way up to our HTML and being able to specify exactly where that click event occurred all the way from the parent to the child's HTML element. It's a pretty cool while loop. Check it out and feel free to play around with it and console log all throughout it that you want. And then the next thing we're going to be looking at is an action. And what we're doing is we're just assigning path and type to our action object. And I just did this for cleanliness of being able to specify if there's nothing there, try to get the data set analytics data. Otherwise, get path. And if there's no analytics, or if there is analytics action, get that, or the type that we're going to be passing in as the event type. which in this case is generally going to be the click event, right? So then we're going to probably be passing path and event type as it comes in. And then what we're going to do is we're going to just assign that with template literals into our query. And we're going to have a mutation amplitude event. As I showed from earlier, this is what we were writing out and what we'll be console logging right here. And it'll just show and let us understand that we should be getting the timestamp, which in my case is Eastern Standard. The type, which is going to be action.click, right? Coming from line 53 here. Action.path 52. User ID, that is coming from our Google Analytics, right? So that is now a state variable that we have here that we assigned on line 20. So now we'll be able to reference it here. And that's how we're going to tie our amplitude data with our Google Analytics data, is by associating it by the same user ID that's being passed. And then all we want in response is the code 200 and all the other stuff. But really, we can just take one of these and make sure we're getting the right response, right? But I'll just pass them all in to show that that's what we're getting from our amplitude type event in our GraphQL schema, right? This individual one, we're just asking for that when we write out our amplitude event. We're able to ask for any of the data that belongs to this individual type inside of our mutation, right? So now we come down and we have a very similar thing here where we have, if we have a URL, fetch the URL, stringify this entire mutation, send it as JSON, pass in the key for our authorization inside of our headers, make it a post event. And I added this here, but you don't really need it, right? That's all you need for a fetch. But so that we can see that response, I then am going to console log this for us and be able to see that data coming in, so that it's just for us to see on the console to understand exactly that the response worked, right? That's what this allows us to do, is see what response we get, if we get an error or if it succeeds. And that's the end of our handler. So without further ado, we don't need that, right? We're just looking here, refresh this page. And we know we're probably going to click the app header because that's the majority of this page. But let's click this little line here and see what happens. Awesome. All right, there we go. So let's kind of dive in and see what we clicked on. So the first thing we clicked on was P, which is a paragraph text. Code, right? I clicked specifically this code tag. So it captured the code, which if I were to scroll up here, you'd see that it grabs tag here, puts it in. There's no class associated, no ID, P tag, no class, no ID. So then it captures those two. And then we move up to the header, right? And then we start getting into the header where we have header dot app dash header, right? So that means it was able to capture here the dot class that we're able to get for each one. Classes join, bring them together, and then add it to any previous path that we had in it. And then works up to div.app class, div, pound, hashtag, however you refer to it. Root, that's the ID, the root of our app. Body, HTML, all the way up to our HTML every single time. And then we had a click event that was associated with 2:33 p.m. And then we had the user ID being captured. And then our response, right, that we asked for, we were able to see here. We got the response, and the response was an amplitude event. We're still looking, code 200, right? One event that we logged, small bytes, and the amount of time, which I believe is just a timestamp associated with how long it took for us to be able to actually upload that. And so now we officially, congratulations, have a log. So now we have one individual tracking here in real time, right? One individual that's currently on the site, that's me, associated with that user ID. And then if we pop over here and look in user lookup, 21 minutes, we're still waiting. 2 minutes ago, I think that was it, right? 20371, click event. Let's take a peek. Booyah. Got the path, got a click event, got it associated with the same user ID that we had over here in analytics. And now we can come to the conclusion that, okay, this user had one session for 3 minutes and 47 seconds at this point, sat on our homepage because they're really boring, and clicked our header. So this person doesn't do anything. They are just a robot clicking things, but in reality, it's me showing you an awesome way of tracking events through GraphQL. And so what's happening here is the moment that this actually occurred, right? We just ran a fetch request that sent that data over to Amplitude, and we just got that data response saying, congrats, you sent it through StepSend's API using GraphQL schema, and you wrote a mutation successfully, and you were able to send the user ID associated with all this extra click data, along with the fact that Google Analytics the entire time is tracking our application. And that's about it. And that's how quickly you can run one of these apps up. And you can read through this blog if you have any blockers while you're running through this and see in detail maybe what you're missing as you want to be able to go through this. And I ran dev, and I believe start ran it up for me as well. And if you kind of come through here, it's in your package.json. Yeah. I kind of want to do more of this to be able to show how we can be able to capture more events as they occur throughout your application. But for right now, this is a very simple way of being able to send one to a single API, but you can use StepSend's awesome like @sequence directive to be able to run more of these kind of events sequentially and be able to capture more and more events and send them to more backend APIs so you can analyze your users' interactions with your application further and further enhance your application as you continue going forward. And that's the demo. Just a simple React app, but so much going on in the background of allowing you to understand the interaction going on with your user and your application. There's no questions, then I don't see any. Then thanks for coming. Thank you for checking it out. It was great showing you how you can do a lot of other things other than build on the core of your React application and all the capabilities that React hooks give us so that we can ensure that, more importantly, what you saw comes with a lot of complexity, but we were able to write it out using React hooks and the ease of using React hooks to initialize a single event, be able to track a single user on a single path, and be able to track a single click event, and then remove that event in case if we have a lot of events happening in order. And I said the fancy word earlier, sequentially throughout our application to ensure that we are adding that event listener, handling it, writing our mutation, sending it off to our backend, and then being able to remove that and immediately initialize again. And so thanks for coming, and till next time.